Hello, everybody. I'm Kimberly Adams. I'm a correspondent at Marketplace, public radio show, and also a member of the Board of Governors here at the National Press Club. So thank you all very much for coming today. So welcome to Magazine Writing Make the Leap. I'm delighted to introduce your instructor, Richard Just. Yay. Richard is the editor of the Washington Post magazine. He's also a former editor of the New Republic and a former editor of National Journal magazine. He has also worked at Newsweek and the American Prospect, and he leads the Princeton University Summer Journalism Program, an amazing, exhausting, exhilarating endeavor that brings high school students from low-income backgrounds to Princeton for a 10-day crash course in journalism and college admissions. Please join me in welcoming Richard. Actually, quick pause. Could those of you with a lot of gaps on your row consider sliding down a bit just so if people join late, they're not crossing over in front of people? All right, now really, Richard.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm mic'd, yeah. Thank you. All right, thank you guys all for coming. It's great to meet you. I've structured this talk as a kind of look inside the head of a magazine editor. So one caveat to start is that you would get a different look depending on who the editor is, depending on which magazine they work for. Nothing I'm going to tell you today about magazine writing should be taken as magazine gospel. There is no such thing. But I hope to give you a general sense of the way I think about stories, the way we think about stories at the Post magazine, and I think there is considerable overlap between the way we think about stories and what you would hear from editors at other magazines. I also hope to give you a sense not just of how to do magazine journalism, which is the main kind of point of this talk, but also why. What it is that magazine journalism adds to the world that's so wonderful and so distinct from other forms of journalism. So the way I've structured this is into three parts. I want to walk you through what I kind of think of as the two different kinds of magazine articles. That'll be the first two parts, and then we'll talk a little bit about some kind of general writing tips that I have for magazines that I think carry over no matter what kind of magazine piece you're writing. So the way I think about this is that there are two types of magazine articles: pure narratives and ideas-driven pieces. So I want to start with pure narratives. Pure narratives, in my experience, are the much rarer kind of magazine article. They are wonderful when they're done well, but I would say they constitute maybe only like 5% of pieces. I think people tend to overestimate the percentage of magazine articles that fall into this category because the ones that you do read, that do make it to publication, are amazing and tend to be really, really memorable. They're often the magazine pieces that win awards, that break through, that get made into movies. But they're not in my view or my experience the majority of magazine pieces. The reason these kinds of stories are so rare is that the story has to be amazing because the story is the thing that justifies the existence of the piece. It's so suspenseful or intriguing or bizarre or funny or dramatic that it stands on its own, and people will read it just to hear a good yarn. So a lot of true crime stories fall into this category. A lot of New Yorker stories fall into this category. David Grann, maybe a name some of you have heard, New Yorker writer, writes like one big piece a year. His stories fall into this category. The Atavist is a newer and great source of these kinds of narratives. And for the most part, these stories have no larger point, no overriding idea. They're just great tales told from start to finish, and they draw you in simply on those terms. So as a result, for me as an editor, the bar for commissioning these kinds of stories is really high because there's no added value to it beyond just the story itself. So we don't run a lot of these at the Washington Post magazine because we have that high bar for these kinds of stories. I would say we've run 2 in the last year. Again, when we do them, they're amazing, they're rewarding, they're great fun to edit and great fun to read. But the story itself has to really justify this approach. The structure of, so because the core elements of a pure narrative are basically suspense and chronology, just like the reader in their brain wants to know what happened next and what happened after that. The structure of pure narratives is actually pretty simple for the most part. You've probably noticed this, but like most New Yorker stories are just A to B narratives. They just start at the beginning and work their way through chronologically. And they're deriving they're deriving the pleasure of reading them just from you, the reader, wanting to know what happens next. The way I offer the structure of pure narratives is a little bit different. I like to pick out the best scene from anywhere in the chronology, not a scene that gives away the ending necessarily, but a scene that drops the reader immediately into a place where they're going to be fascinated, intrigued. Have that be the opening, the lead, the opening section, end the first section with some kind of cliffhanger, and then at the start of the second section back all the way up to the beginning, whatever the chronological starting point of the story is, and then tell the story moving forward from there as just an A, B, C, D narrative. So the stories are very difficult to find, difficult to report, but the writing of them, the structure of them, is actually pretty straightforward. I want to spend more time on the other kind of magazine story because it's what I spend probably 95% of my job doing, and I think it accounts, as I said, for most magazine articles. And this is where I always like to think of it as the meeting of the world of facts and the world of ideas. The world of facts we could think of as like newspaper reporting, news journalism, finding out what's going on in the world and relaying it to readers. And the world of ideas I think of as like op-eds, academia, the world of arguments, of theories, of points that people want to make. And what I love so much about magazine journalism is that magazine journalism borrows the best of both these worlds. It combines these things. It's reporting, it's storytelling, it's finding out things that people want to and should know, but it's using those things to advance an idea to make an argument. And the argument itself, the idea, is the thing that readers are coming for. It's the selling point for the piece. It's why, as an editor, I can justify publishing it. It's why we can justify asking readers to spend an hour of their time, which is what it takes to read, let's say, a 7,000-word piece. Because at the end, they're going to come away with new facts, yes, but they're going to come away with a new idea as well. The single most important advice I always give people for getting started on these kinds of stories is what I call the rule of one sentence. You have to have one idea. And paradoxically, the longer the magazine piece is, the more important it is that you can fit everything into one umbrella. I think often people think, well, it's a 7,000-word piece. That means I can range widely. But the longer the piece is, the more you're asking of the reader. So I would say the more it becomes incumbent upon us to have the intellectual discipline to make sure that when they're done spending that hour reading the piece, they're walking away knowing what it was we were trying to communicate. If it was a profile, knowing what our theory of the person was. Not that we had 10 different theories, not that we were like weighing in on a subject or ranging widely or just exploring a subject, but knowing that at the end of the day, we, the writer, the editor, have the discipline to figure out what it is we wanted to say about what we were writing about. So the caveat here is, of course, there can be sub-ideas. You're not just going to say the same thing over and over again. That would make an article repetitive. But you really want that nut graph at the top and the headline to be an umbrella that everything that comes after that fits under. But that one-sentence argument, not just any one-sentence argument works. The one-sentence argument, the one-sentence idea, the theory of the case, whatever you want to call it, has to have certain characteristics. And you'd get different answers to this from different editors, but I kind of like to break these into three categories. I like to think that the idea that we're going into the piece with has to be surprising, novel, and relevant. And these, this is a room full of journalists, so these will all be familiar to you. So surprising. I often think about this as, can the idea be framed in opposition to some kind of conventional wisdom? Everyone thinks X, but in fact Y is true. So I know this kind of counterintuitiveness in journalism sometimes gets a bad rap because it can be overdone, and there are publications that maybe have a reputation for taking that style of thinking too far. But it's gotten a bad rap unjustifiably in the sense that it really is the thing that undergirds magazine writing and undergirds my thinking and other editors' thinking when we think about whether it's worth commissioning a piece. Like, we don't want to spend 7,000 words making a point that's going to be obvious to people, where at the end of the piece they're going to say, well, duh, I could have guessed that, or duh, I knew that. We want to surprise them. So within reason, not taken to too far an extreme, this kind of counterintuitive thinking is a good way to think about what that one overarching theory of the case, that one overarching idea should be for your piece. Related, the idea should be novel. It's got to add something to the conversation. If the idea has been put forward already then for me the bar becomes higher to explain why that idea is worth advancing again. So I think about this in terms of a profile. If somebody comes to me and wants to profile any person, the first thing I want to know is, okay, what other magazines have profiled him or her? And if they've been profiled already, then we have to think about whether our profile is going to advance a different theory of the case of them, or is going to advance different facts about them, or is going to build to a different idea about who they are or what they're contributing. So it's really important for me to make sure that we're not just running over the same territory with this overarching idea that other magazines have already been through. Did I skip over one? Well, somehow, okay. I apologize. I didn't get to, I forgot the slide for relevant. I was doing this too fast. Relevant you get. And my point about relevant is just to say that relevance is contextual for magazines. So what's relevant for a political magazine is very different from what's relevant for a sports magazine, for a magazine like Outside that does an amazing job of writing about the great outdoors. And of course, there's an entirely different conversation as to what's relevant for a general interest magazine. That's probably the broadest. But the story has to be something that's going to be, like, it can meet all these other tests, but if it's not about a relevant subject, for me, it's going to be a high bar to clear as a magazine editor. So at the Washington Post magazine, relevance often just means, is it about politics or does it have some connection to the city of Washington? And of course, you'd get different answers from different magazine editors, but that's where I often look for that to fulfill that test. So one tip that, in terms of headlines, one tip that I would often give writers is that even before you write your piece, it's worth it to try to combine all those elements, the surprising, the novel, the relevant, that sense of counterintuitivity, that sense we're giving people something new that they haven't seen before, and see if you can distill it into a 5 to 10 word headline. It doesn't mean it's going to be the headline of the piece, but it's just a useful exercise to go through. Like, is this going to be something that's going to make someone want to pick up the magazine? Is this going to be something that's going to make someone want to click? Does this idea meet these tests? And so I'm just going to give some examples here. These are mostly very well-known magazine articles that I think were very well conceived in this way. They all involved reporting. They all involved storytelling. They all revealed new information. But they were all built around an idea that was provocative somehow, counterintuitive, surprising, and relevant. It was about something that there would be an audience for people to want to read about. Many of you, I'm sure, have read David Foster Wallace's piece, Roger Federer's Religious Experience, which is the definitive profile/argument about Roger Federer. Next piece is a piece by my old colleague John Chait, a liberal defense of football. The Hell of American Daycare was another piece by a former colleague, John Cohn, that pretty much says it all in just 5 words. It's going to be a deep, investigative deconstruction of what is wrong with American daycare. Of course, you all know Ta-Nehisi Coates is perhaps the most famous and perhaps most consequential and influential magazine article of the past decade, The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic. Another one that is up there is one of the most consequential articles in terms of just shifting a conversation in our country, Anne-Marie Slaughter's Why Women Still Can't Have It All. And then I threw in one from our magazine from 2 years ago, DC is Now a Cool City, That's Terrible News for American Democracy. It was a provocative piece that got a lot of attention, but again, you can see how from the outset, the writer and I knew that was the central idea. We could distill it down to just like 2 very short sentences that we thought would provoke people and justify commissioning the piece. So I want to just walk through really quickly the structure for idea-driven magazine pieces. This will be familiar to everyone, I think, in this room, because it's derived from many other forms of journalism. But generally, we start our pieces with some kind of narrative lead. It's generally the scene that we have, the moment that we have, that is most likely to draw people in, that's most provocative or funny or moving or somehow generate some emotion to kind of rope readers into the piece. And then usually that segues into a nut graph, which is that one idea. It's the one theory of the case or the one question we're going to be asking. This is a profile of X person. Here's what we're going to ask about that person. Or here's the argument we're going to make about that person. And that usually ends the first section of the piece. And then we usually start the second section by backing up to some chronological beginning point in the story. It might be last year, it might be 200 years ago, but some moment that allows us to for the reader to feel like we're kind of moving forward in the story, like the story is going to have some chronology to it, some narrative, some storytelling, and this is where there's overlap between this kind of magazine piece and the pure narratives we were talking about at the start. And then we try to make the story unfold in a way that's chronological, that's based on storytelling and scene, but that at each point is reinforcing the main idea, either answering the question we've posed or reinforcing the main argument that we want to make. Again, this concept will be familiar to all of you, but at some point in a magazine story, as in a really intellectually honest, smart op-ed, there's going to be a kind of to be sure moment. There should be some moment where, because the story is driven by an idea, where you engage with the caveats, the complications, the potential problems or objections to the idea. It doesn't literally have to start with to be sure. It doesn't need to be kind of clunky or utilitarian in that way, but you do want the reader to walk away with that sense that you have engaged possible objections or complications to the overall point that they're making. And then, of course, the kicker. A magazine kicker can take any number of forms. I'm a big fan of ending with an incredibly resonant quote. I'm also a big fan of the callback, which is a great magazine art that maybe is not used often enough, and that actually I probably don't even use often enough because it takes some effort to find the right way to do it. But this idea of having the last sentence be something that returns to an idea or a phrase from earlier in the story that the reader may have forgotten, but that you can get a kind of emotional punch by having them come back to. Okay, that's part two. And then part three, I just want to kind of walk through some tips about writing that I think this is more kind of writing at the sentence by sentence level that maybe distinguish magazine writing from other forms of writing and that carry through no matter what kind of magazine piece you're working on. First one is so obvious, but it's write a great first sentence. So I wanted to just put up a few examples of first sentences I've really liked from over the years. This was from a piece a very deep investigation of Amtrak and what was wrong with Amtrak. Every Washingtonian's favorite subject to gripe about why America can't have a better railroad system. So when I was at National Journal, we commissioned a great reporter named Simon Van Zuylen-Wood to do a long piece, just spending months digging into the bureaucracy of Amtrak to try to figure out what was wrong with the place. And he led the story with 39 minutes into southbound ride from Wilmington, Delaware to Washington, D.C. Joseph Boardman, president and CEO of Amtrak, begins to cry. So Simon is a very talented reporter and I think good at provocation, actually made Mr. Boardman cry during their interview. It's contextual, it's not unfair. He was crying because he was describing how awful and difficult it is to be the head of an organization that's so widely derided by the people who use it. And I think Simon knew right away when he had that moment, I think probably as he looked at his watch to note that it was 39 minutes, that was going to be the first sentence of his piece. Simon's a really good writer. He's one of my longtime colleagues at a bunch of different publications, and so I'm actually going to put up one more from him. This one is a little more controversial among some of my friends and colleagues over the years when I've used this as an example. So I just have to do this, show of hands. How many of you recognize the name Barbara Buono before I put up this? Okay. Poor Barbara Buono has been forgotten. So Barbara Buono was the poor politician who had the honor of running against Chris Christie as the Democratic nominee for governor in 2013 in New Jersey. So it's hard to remember now because Christie is so unpopular and so disliked by New Jersey and in many other places as well. But in 2013, he was like one of the most popular governors, I think, in like the history of the country. And he was cakewalking to re-election, even in a very liberal state like New Jersey. And Barbara Buono was nominated to run against him. And she just couldn't get attention from the media, from anyone. So I was at Newsweek at the time, and I asked Simon to go just spend a lot of time with Barbara Buono's campaign and write a piece about what it was like to be a serious person, an established politician. She had a good reputation in New Jersey. She'd been in the state legislature for a long time. She was respected, who was running in a state where politically, like on all the issues, she aligned with everyone, or with the vast majority of voters, and yet she could not break through. So the controversy about this lead is the question is whether, and you can have your own opinions about this, and I'm sure some of you will disagree with me. The question is whether this lead is an excessive stunt. So Simon went running with Barbara Buono one morning, and then she said he could shower at her house. And so Simon came up with, it's 8:35 a.m., I'm naked in Barbara Buono's bathroom. It's a little bit of a stunt, and it doesn't necessarily have a ton to do with the rest of the story, but we just felt like we had to find something to draw readers into this person they never heard of and this story that otherwise the bar to clear was going to be a little bit higher. And so we went with the first person stunt. Andy Kohler, who organized this whole event and who's also a former colleague of mine and has worked with Simon as well. When I sent over the slide for her to look at, she was like, "Oh, please don't use that lead. I hate that lead." But so anyway, so opinions will differ. But one way to pull off a fun first sentence is to be to try for a stunt, and in the right circumstances, it can work. Um, yeah, of course. Yeah, please.
What was her reaction
To that lead.
Because I mean, suggests that there is a very sexual.
So I think we quickly cleared that up in the story. Maybe we don't clear it up here in the first paragraph, but I think it was very quickly cleared up in like paragraph number 2. I don't actually know how she responded. My sense at the time was that she was very grateful for any attention she could get, and she was like, she had a big story about her Newsweek that week, and that was going to be more than she was going to expect. It was a pretty straightforward headline. I think I don't remember exactly, but I think it was something like what is it like to run for governor, and when nobody will know? What is it like to be a politician that no one will pay attention to? Right. Okay, so this is a little more traditional. It's from a piece that a wonderful magazine writer named Jason Zengerle wrote for me at the New Republic when I was the editor over there. And this story is actually a pure narrative. It's an amazing story about, well, a guy some of you may have heard of named Jeff Smith, who was a state legislator in Missouri who had very high ambitions and ended up being caught up in an FBI probe that derailed his career. He had done some criminal things. Anyway, without going into all the details about the story starts with this very dramatic scene of a bombing in which Jeff Smith had not done, but it was sort of tangentially connected. A bombing in a parking lot. And I've just always loved these first 2 sentences. There's something Jason's a very lyrical writer, and it just immediately puts you in the scene. The bomber carried balloons. They were silver and purple, and when he stepped inside the parking garage, they flitted and danced around his head, obscuring his face as well as his intentions. It's just something about the rhythm of it that's really nice, and you want to know more. And that was the point of this scene in the story, was to draw you in, and it's the point of any lead, to draw you in and hope that you want to learn more. The point I want to make about all these leads, though, is one that is probably obvious to many of you in this room, which is that detailed reporting is the basis for great writing. It's hard to manufacture great writing out of, at least great magazine writing, out of no reporting or weak reporting. But in all 3 of these examples, it was the reporting that set up the ability to have great writing. So I think about the one I just showed you, Jason, right? Like, in order to write that lead, he had to obtain, I don't actually remember because this was almost 10 years ago, he either had to obtain the security camera footage from the bombing, which he may have, or at the very least, he had to talk to people who had seen that footage and were really able to provide him with granular detail down to the ways the balloons were dancing, the colors of the balloons. Again, obvious to all journalists, but that level of detail makes those sentences, and without it, those sentences are much flatter. Finally, if you don't have a great first sentence, you could write a few great first sentences. I had nothing to do with this piece. This is by Scott Stossel, who was a longtime editor of the print magazine at The Atlantic, an amazing writer. This is from a long piece he wrote that did very, very well a number of years ago, got a lot of attention, all about his personal struggle with anxiety. I'll read through this very, very quickly, but I don't think the first sentence here is great, but the cumulative effect of these sentences definitely, I think, makes you want to read on. I finally settled on a pre-talk regimen that enables me to avoid weeks of anticipatory misery that the approach of public speaking engagement would otherwise produce. Let's say you're sitting in an audience, I'm at the lectern, here's what I've likely done to prepare. 4 hours or so ago, I took my first half milligram of Xanax. I've learned that if I wait too long to take it, my flight or fight response kicks in so far into overdrive that medication is not enough to yank it back. Then about an hour ago, I took my second half milligram of Xanax and perhaps 20 milligrams of Inaugural. I need the whole milligram of Xanax, et cetera, et cetera. I won't subject you to the whole thing. You can read it for yourself, but you can see how the layering on of information here is just, he's building to an idea and a feeling that, at least as a reader, made me want to read on. And the rest of the piece is really well written. If you haven't read it, it was in The Atlantic many years ago. I highly recommend looking it up. So again, not one sentence here, not 2 sentences, but the accumulation of a set of ideas that gives you a real kind of emotional reaction and makes you want to read on.
What was his name again?
This is Scott Stossel, yeah, longtime editor at The Atlantic. And actually my very first boss in journalism. He was the editor of the American Prospect when I was there, so I learned a lot from him. So one question that comes up with magazine writing a lot at a line-by-line level is first person. And this is one of the places where magazine writing differs from news writing, obviously, but differs from other forms of long form, including newspaper long form, feature writing that you might see in newspapers. Most newspaper feature writing, although this is starting to change a little bit, is told from that classic news omniscient point of view. Magazine writing is rarely told, and I would argue should rarely be told, from an omniscient point of view. It doesn't mean that you, the writer, has to be a character a major character in every story, and that's a judgment call that you and your editor certainly should work on. Like, it's definitely possible to put yourself in a story more than you should be. But I like to have just a tiny bit of first person, at least, in every piece we run. And that can be as small as taking the form of using told me instead of says, or alternating told me with says, which we do as a standard practice at the Washington Post magazine. I think it's more, this is where my sort of own feelings as a bit of a magazine supremacist come through. No disparagement to other forms of journalism, which I respect, but I love magazines for a reason. I think it's actually more intellectually honest with readers, and it's one of the things that I love about magazines. More honest than the sort of omniscient said. As you all know, like, a quote was always said in some context. It was said to you as a reporter, or it was said to a press conference. But people don't just speak out into the ether, which is the impression that one could get from reading 99% of newspaper pieces. Magazines are peeling back the curtain a little bit on that architecture of putting together a piece, of how information comes to be in front of you, the reader. And told me is just like a really subtle way of letting the reader know that this quote was not just set out into the ether, it was said to a person. That person is me, the reporter, and it's refracted through my memory, it's refracted through my decisions about which parts of the quote to include, about what to tell you. And there are other little ways along those lines that I, as an editor, encourage writers to put themselves in scenes as well. To sort of say things like, I'm sitting down with so-and-so in their living room, and then the conversation begins, as opposed to just beginning the conversation. Sometimes that can feel forced and trite, and it's always a case-by-case basis. I sometimes roll my eyes at the convention of, like, always describing what the person was eating while they were talking to you if you were interviewing them in a restaurant. That can be, like, kind of lame, especially when it starts to feel like it's in every single story in your magazine. But I do think little hints of that first person storytelling, even in a story where you're fundamentally not a character, I kind of defend that and like it and think it's worth doing. And then, of course, you have the ability, as with Scott Stossel's piece, or as with the Amtrak piece, or the Barbara Buono piece, to really make yourself a character in the piece. And sometimes that is not just justified, it's necessary, and allows you to tell a story that you otherwise would not have been able to tell. And this goes without saying, but part of the fun of being a magazine journalist is the ability to write beautifully. It's not your diary. It's being published for the world. It's not just a sort of pure piece of art, a pure kind of passion project that you as a writer have total control over. It's a collaboration between you and an editor and a fact checker and a copy editor and a story editor and a top editor and all the people who go into shaping a magazine story. And when you're writing for a magazine, depending on the different magazines have different senses of how closely you have to write in their voice versus write in your own voice. So none of this is to say that what you write as a magazine writer is always a kind of pure expression of your own sense of what beautiful writing is. But at some fundamental level, it should be something beautiful. It should be something that a reader is going to be impressed with, not just for the information it relays, or not just for the ideas that it relays, but actually, like, as a work of art. That to me is part of the fun of being a magazine journalist, is that we're creating things that can be artistic, and writing beautifully is part of the pleasure of creating those things. So the final note before I take questions, which I'm very excited to talk to you all and hear what's on your mind, is just a note about pitching. I think a great pitch encompasses all the things we have been talking about. It signals to the editor that there's going to be nice writing. It signals fundamentally that there's a new idea, an idea that's surprising, or in the case of a pure narrative, that you've got a story that is so spectacular that it could go, like, right from being published in the magazine to potentially being made into a movie because it's so suspenseful and dramatic, and it meets that kind of very high bar for a pure narrative. And yeah, so that's what a good pitch delivers. I just went back in my email and grabbed from many years ago an example of what I thought was a really strong pitch. This was a story we ran at National Journal. It was a largely first person. It was sort of 50% first person, 50% reported story by a writer named Tiffany Stanley, all about her, well, the first person part was about her experience as the main caregiver for her aunt as she was dying from Alzheimer's. And the larger policy story, which justified its inclusion in National Journal, was about the ways in which we as a country, as a government, at a policy level, are failing caregivers of folks with Alzheimer's and dementia, and failing the folks who have these terrible diseases as well. And it was deeply reported. I mean, she really dug into the policy element of the story, but she leavened, well, leaven's the wrong word because it was a very sad piece, but she made that policy element so readable and so personal and so compelling by interweaving it with the story of her aunt. And Tiffany's a great writer, and so I worked with her before, so I knew it would be well written, but even if I hadn't known her, this is just like a very well written pitch, and one that I think communicates that there's going to be an idea here that's going to be compelling enough to carry a piece, as well as a narrative element that's going to play into that idea. This piece ultimately was a finalist for a National Magazine Award, and was printed in Best American Magazine Writing of 2015. So Tiffany absolutely delivered on what was a very promising pitch. That is all I have. I think we have a substantial amount of time for questions, which I'm really excited about. And so please let me know what's on your mind.
If you could, raise your hand, I'll give you a mic because this is being videotaped, so we need the voices of the questions as well. If you could identify yourself when you ask.
My name is Frances Harden. When thinking about where you want to publish something, what's that process like? I mean, obviously your subject matter is going to determine it, but maybe there's some other elements I don't know about.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is a crass thing, right? It's like if you know an editor there, that makes it a lot easier. And and I'll be honest, like as an editor, it's easier to work with writers you've worked with before. You know their strengths, hopefully many strengths. If they have weaknesses, you know what those weaknesses are, and then you're more prepared for what you can fill in as an editor to kind of help with that process. That said, at the Post magazine, as everywhere I've been, I love working with new writers as well. I think part of the obligation of a magazine editor is to always be looking for new writers, looking for maybe people who haven't published in big magazines. There's nothing more satisfying as an editor than feeling like you helped to help the person along in their career and maybe publish their first big magazine piece. From a writer's point of view, I think understanding the magazine you're pitching to, and so much of that goes to the relevance question, the subject of the magazine, also the type of stories the magazine specializes in. Where do they fall? If I kind of presented it as this hard binary division between these two stories, but you can also think of it as kind of a spectrum, right? Pure narrative to more argument, idea-driven pieces. Like, where do magazines fall on that spectrum? And that has nothing to do with the quality of the magazine. Like, The New Yorker is an amazing magazine. They publish very different types of stories than, say, Politico magazine, which is also a very good magazine. So yeah, I think just understanding the nature of the place you're pitching to, and understanding not just the subject matter, but the type of story that they're looking for.
Just following up on that, my name is Maria Recio, and I write for the Austin American-Statesman newspaper and sometimes Texas Monthly.
Nice.
And so
Great
had
magazine.
an interesting background, but specifically on the Washington Post magazine, because I think a lot of us maybe find it a little difficult to break into some of other areas if we are interested in pitching to you,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah.
How do we go about it,
Yeah.
and what do you like to see? Just one page, or
Yeah. I like to get something like this, 2 or 3 paragraphs. And then if I'm intrigued, often it makes sense to follow up with a phone call. Part of my job at the magazine is to kind of figure out the big picture of what we're doing in any given week, what stories we're commissioning looking months ahead. So if I get a pitch, let's say like this, that I'm intrigued by, but I haven't met you before, then maybe I would propose getting on the phone and often looping into that conversation one of my colleagues who would be the story editor on the story, and that person, assuming we go forward with it, would become the main person that would work with you through the whole process. And then I often get back involved at the end and do kind of a second round of editing once the story editor is kind of done with it. But yeah, there's no magic to it. I just like to see a great pitch, a great idea, and then often follow up with a phone call.
what's your email?
Oh, yes, I was planning to give it to you. I was not withholding that. So it's richard.just, J-U-S-T, @washpost.com.
Hi, my name is Camila DeShalis. I'm with CQ Roll Call. I was just curious on your take about the word length for some magazine pieces. How do you determine how
Yeah.
long, especially given in this age where, you know what I mean, a lot of publications are trying to make articles short, or at least mine is. You know, like how do
Yeah.
you determine how long a magazine piece should be?
So our longest story in each issue of the magazine can range anywhere from 25, sort of 2,500 word. That would probably be the shortest length we'd ever run on as a cover story, all the way up to, I think the longest story we've run in the last year was 13,000 words. That's the extreme end. I think we've only crossed the 10,000 word mark a few, maybe 2 or 3 times in the past year. I would say the average cover story for us is about 5,000 words. It's tough. On the one hand, as an editor, as a magazine junkie, I love nothing more than a great long piece that just goes for it, right? Because like, that's what magazines can do that no other part of the Washington Post is going to do for the most part, and what most other publications aren't going to do. So when a story merits that length, I want to do it. Like that's really great. There is kind of a flip side danger to that as a magazine editor, where you can kind of like fall in love with the very idea of a long story. Like the story's length becomes the thing that makes it significant. And that's not good either, because a story has to earn its word count. There are lots, I would say, there are lots of instances of like a writer maybe wanting a story to be 7,000, 8,000 words, but really that's a stronger story if it's like 4,000 or 5,000 words. So I'm always kind of balancing those two things in my head. I'm like wanting to go for those big projects, and when I and my colleagues and the writer think a project merits that, we're like absolutely open to that. Almost like 13,000 words is like almost like towards a short book. But we're not going to make that the default, and we do want to kind of be this check on ourselves where we're not doing long stories just to say we do long stories. But I would say like most other general interest magazines, that's kind of the range you see. I mean, a 2,500 word magazine piece can be a great piece. That's not necessarily an inferior piece to a 13,000 word story. So does that, I hope that, yeah.
But do you say how many words you think it's going to be?
So at the start, we try to kind of make a rough agreement with the writer about that, so that they're not blindsided, and so that they kind of go into the project knowing what it is. It's also true that, like a lot of magazines, we pay by word count. We pay $1.50 a word for a story. So that can drastically alter how much the writer ends up being paid, and we try to be honest with them at the outset about what we're looking at. I mean, we pay by word count because that 13,000 word piece was like a 6-month-long project for that writer, simply because it was so involved, because there was so much to uncover. And so I think for the most part, that's a fair way to pay, because shorter stories just tend to be less work.
When you pitch it, you pitch.
Oh, when you pitch, I'm sorry. You can. Yeah, you can give a sense of that. You can give a sense of that, or you can kind of say, like, I'm envisioning this as like a feature-length magazine story. And feature average, so for us, an average feature length is like 4,000, 5,000, maybe 6,000 words. Yeah, if you look at the publication and maybe kind of try to get a sense for what their average looks like, yeah, that's maybe a way to go about it. Yeah, I mean, stories also change in scope and change in length. Sometimes they'll grow as the writer reports, and I'm totally open to that. Sometimes they'll shrink, and then the writer has to be open to the fact that maybe what began as an 8,000 word piece actually makes more sense as a 4,000 word piece.
If you haven't done feature writing before, or
Yeah.
magazine style writing
Yeah.
before, like for example, my background is in radio. I write
Right.
very, very short things.
Yeah.
What sort of evidence, assuming you receive a strong pitch, are you
Yeah.
looking for from people that makes you feel like they can actually do it? And
It's
then I have a follow-up.
Yeah, it's a great question. And like, to be totally honest, one of the things that I often want to see if I've got a great idea, but I've never worked with the writer before and I'm kind of not sure, is like, okay, have they done this before? And sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes we want to take the risk and go for it anyway. But sometimes that can be like a concern. Not because we don't believe in the writer's ability to do it, but just because our time is limited, and putting out a weekly magazine, our resources are stretched. And so if we were to go forward on a piece and it eventually came in and it just needed a ton of work, like that's not a situation we want to put ourselves in if we can avoid it at the outset. But to your question, how to show that you can do it, I mean, I think if you can show other kinds of reporting that even if they're not done at this length, show that level of detail and show that kind of beautiful writing and that capacity for observation and like all the kind of things that like go into a magazine piece, I think a lot of editors will say, you know what, this makes sense. We could go ahead with this. I mean, at the Post magazine, we take a lot of risks on writers. Like we do pieces by writers that have never written magazine pieces before because they have an amazing idea, or because they've just started to do some amazing reporting and we're so intrigued and we're like, you know what, the absolute worst that happens here is in the end the story doesn't work out. That's not the case for most of our stories, but that's the worst that can happen, and that's not such an awful outcome. Probably what's going to happen is that the story might need a little bit more work than somebody who's a veteran magazine writer, but that's okay too, because those can be the most rewarding stories.
You meant
Do you want to include clips then?
Yeah, clips are worthwhile. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
you mentioned that some of the projects take like 6 months of reporting, but once the reporting is done, what's the timeline for sort of the rounds of editing and fact checking? And if you receive a pitch like this,
Yeah.
how far in advance do you want to receive that pitch compared to when it might run in the magazine?
Yes, and that's a great question because we often receive pitches that have some kind of time element to them. Like, you know, I'm envisioning this as a potential Veterans Day piece or potential Mother's Day piece or whatever, and so we do have to think backwards. The answer is not a simple one, but I would say our average turnaround time from the moment we get a pitch and decide we're going to do a story to the moment it appears in the magazine is definitely a matter of months. I would say 6 months is probably on the longer end. We've had pieces that have been worked on for closer to a year, but that's probably the exception. I would say average time is like 3 or 4 months. At the Post magazine, we have an annoyingly long lead time at the printer, so we always have to factor that in. Our magazine goes to press 2 weeks before you actually see it on Sunday. So sometimes writers don't take that into account. They pitch us more as if they're pitching to the newspaper, and they might say, I've got a great Veterans Day piece, and they're pitching us like the week before Veterans Day or 2 weeks before Veterans Day, and it's like the Veterans Day magazine is like already at the printer.
Is that the norm?
Sorry, the norm for lead time? I've seen it totally different at different magazines. At National Journal, we printed and we were in Congress the next morning at 7 a.m. We have a 2-week lead time. The New York Times magazine, you may notice, has a similar lead time to us. I don't know if it's like a newspaper magazine thing. This is definitely the longest lead time I've worked with. Newsweek was another place that was, because of its legacy as a weekly news magazine, had a much quicker turnaround time. We went to press on Friday nights, and I'm pretty sure the magazine was out over the weekend or maybe Monday at that point. So yeah, I would say think in terms of months, some number of months. The process really varies once the draft comes in. It all depends on like the mix of what we're looking at and the issues in the weeks ahead. And those are the kinds of things that I know drive writers nuts because they're totally out of the writer's control. It has nothing to do with whether your piece was good or needed work or any of those things. It's just we're trying to put together an issue of the magazine each week that's balanced in terms of the types of stories and the subjects. And so I know that can be frustrating for writers, and I have no doubt drive writers nuts while they're waiting for their story to run or even waiting for their story to be edited. But once we start that editing process on a story, I would say it usually involves a few weeks of back and forth with the story editor. And then once the story editor feels like it's in pretty good shape, like they're pretty happy with where it is, then it comes to me. And then, again, it varies how involved I get in a story. Like I tend to get more involved in more complicated stories. But often that's another week or two of back and forth between me and the writer and the story editor. At that point, it's kind of a triangle of back and forth. Once I feel good about where it's at, then it goes to our fact checker. Well, it's a fact checker copy editor. So, you know, a lot of magazines, places like The Atlantic, The New Yorker, have this like amazing fact checking operation, which I wish we could have at the Washington Post magazine. We don't. We have one fact checker who actually only works she works 2 days a week.
Don't tell anyone that.
No. Well, we're doing, well, I should say though, I mean, we're doing more fact checking. I mean, newspapers, you guys know, many of you are news journalists. Newspapers don't have fact checkers. They rely on the writer to get everything right. So we have this additional layer of fact checking that the rest of the newspaper doesn't have, or doesn't have to the extent that we do, but it's still not to the extent that you know, magazines like The Atlantic and The New Yorker have, where they have just an army of fact checkers who basically tear into a piece and re-report it from the ground up, and that process can go on for weeks. Ours is quicker. Ours is more like a week at most, half a day. It usually involves one round of questions from our fact checker to the writer and then a few rounds of responses. Then the piece goes through another round of copy edits. Then usually it goes back to the story editor for one more round. Then it goes to me for one more round. And then it gets proofread. And then with any luck, it goes off to the printer and is perfect and no mistakes of any kind whatsoever, and all the writing is beautiful and exactly the way we want it. So I don't know, if you add up all that, I think it comes out to about months. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Diana Sugg. I wanted to ask, okay, specifically about the structure on the idea-driven stories.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
you have your opening part, you
Yeah.
throw the person in the pool,
Yeah.
you got the context, the nut, whatever, your kicker, and then, as you said, like with narratives, we often like then take a breath, back up,
Right.
and roll forward.
Right.
But with the idea-driven stuff, sometimes there's not a chronology in there. So I was wondering about some of the themes or ways. Do you split it up by theme? Like, what are some of your
Yeah.
tricks of the trade or best practices for structuring those?
Yeah, and as you've identified, like the key to magazine journalism is there has to be a structure. Like this is like, I mean, to me, one of the things, I know there is a structure obviously to news stories as well, but like magazine stories never just like happen or never kind of weave around in a weird direction. Like there's like very intentional thinking about what the sections are, why they are where they are, grouping things according to sections. I mean, honestly, even if there's no chronology, you can usually, like even if there's no obvious chronology in a story, usually you can kind of create one. And it can be like a nice experience for the reader. There's usually, like every story has a backstory. There's always some moment in history to back up to. Like in this story, so, and sometimes you have a choice, right, about like where, so in this story, at the start of the second section, we could have backed up, there were two chronologies. There was the story of Alzheimer's as a public policy and public health problem, and there was Tiffany's individual story of her aunt. So we had a choice about where we backed up to at the start of the first, at the start of the second section. We backed up to the moment Alzheimer's was identified in, I don't know, 1880 by Dr. Alzheimer's, whatever it was. So we created that chronology and then allowed the piece to move forward on that trajectory. And then we had a parallel chronology where the piece moved forward chronologically on the story of Tiffany's aunt. And we always knew, obviously, that the story was going to end with Tiffany's aunt dying. That would be the end point. And then the parallel chronology would end with the current situation of Alzheimer's in the US. So yeah, I think you can often find a chronology even when you don't think there is one. But even if it's not a chronological backing up, it's like some contextual backing up that like lays out the context for the reader in which they're going to be reading the more specific story. That's what I usually look for to start that second section.
I recently had a writer, I do mostly enterprise
Yeah.
project, long pieces, and I was talking about, throw them in the pool or whatever.
Yeah.
Throw them in the pool, give them everything, then make them want to, take a breath, back it up, and roll
Yeah.
forward. The simplest is the best. That's what Roy Peter Clark always says. But this guy actually said to me, yeah, but I always do it that way. Isn't that a cliched structure? This was, but I mean, it is the simplest. It is the best through line, right? Like if you have a chronology, you use it. I mean,
Yeah.
unless there's some issue.
This is where like this was like my caveat to like writing beautifully and like you're not creating this work of art, right? Like you are creating a work of art, but it's a work of art within boundaries, like within rules. Like magazine writing is an actual thing. There's conventions, there's rules, and we observe them for a reason. And part of that is because we want readers to, it works. We know how readers' brains work. We want readers to, and also just part of it is because that's what we do. Like if you want to do some kind of experimental piece of writing that doesn't adhere to these conventions, then maybe you're not doing magazine writing. Maybe you're doing something else. So I mean, honestly, yeah.
He wasn't totally.
Oh no,
He
yeah.
was just kind of saying, well, I always do that.
Right.
Shouldn't I be doing something else? And it's like, but
It's tough. I mean, it's really tough, right? Because like as an editor, I want to encourage writers to experiment, and some experimentation can yield good things. But again, we are playing within rules, and I think the rules are there for a reason.
for a reader to
Yeah.
follow it, it's just easier.
Yeah.
Controlling the pace of information and releasing slowly and all that.
Right. And so much of what we, I
Glad to
think,
hear that.
yeah, I mean, I think so much of what we do as editors is actually funnel great writing, great reporting, smart thinking into this kind of form where it becomes something recognizable as magazine journalism. And I think that's a good thing to do.
We have a little bit over 5 minutes, and there's plenty of questions. So we'll go here, and then there are a couple more down that aisle, and we'll move around.
Hi, I'm Ian James, and you've provided really helpful suggestions on idea-focused stories. I wonder if you have kind of a subset of tips related to investigative magazine stories.
Yeah, so I think with an investigative story, the idea is the thing you're revealing. I would say a lot of the structural tips hold. I think you still want to try to create a narrative, try to create a chronology. You want to have that sense of storytelling. You may even be able to build in some sense of suspense, which I think is something different. I mean, as I understand, I've never been a newspaper investigative editor, but as I understand the classic newspaper investigative structure is you let the reader right away know what it is you've revealed, because that's the news. I think in a magazine investigative structure, you might be more inclined to let the reader know that you have revealed something in the nut graph at the top, but there might be sometimes an argument for creating some suspense around what it is as you allow the chronology of the story to unfold. I mean, one chronology that you can create for a story like this is the chronology, and this can work really well. It can also blow up really badly and become really self-indulgent, but I've seen it work to create a chronology where the actual reporting of the story, the digging in of the reporter as they learn more and more, as they're peeling back the onion of the investigation, that becomes the start to finish chronology that drives the story. And in that chronology, maybe you don't let the reader know everything right away that you've uncovered. Again, you can see all the ways that can be self-indulgent and bad, but I think that's a maybe more magazine spin on investigative stuff.
Could you give us an example? Lorraine Woolard at
Yeah.
Politico, give us an example of a story that was worth 13,000 words.
Yeah, sure. So we did, this was the 13,000 word story we did earlier this year. It was all about the heist of the ruby slippers that Dorothy wore in the Wizard of Oz movie. Oh, all right. So just for those of you who didn't, the quick summary. So a number of years ago, the original ruby slippers that Dorothy wore in the movie, Judy Garland wore, were on display in a small museum in Minnesota, and someone broke in and stole them, and they were never found. Recently, in the last year or two, the FBI found them, but never said how they found them. And so we had a reporter spend, it took her about 6 months, and she dug into the story. She went up there and spent a lot of time with the local police department in Minnesota that had spent years investigating this case. The story was a fun story. It was a kind of caper. She did not conclusively answer the question in the end. This is something we struggled with because I think when she started to do it, we were like holding out hope that she might literally find out exactly what happened. She did not conclusively find out how the FBI found the slippers, but she came pretty close. And she was able at the end to break significant new ground and explain to the reader basically what type of crime it had been. And you know, the structure of the story was pretty simple. We started not with the heist, but we started with the FBI revealing at a news conference that they had recaptured the slippers, and then, but then said, but there were unanswered questions, and people in this town were like, where were they all these years? What happened? And then we backed up to the start, and we told the story of we told it largely through the local police department that had spent many, many years trying to find the slippers, and then eventually brought in the FBI. And it was a really fun story to edit. It was a lot of work. But the writer who did it, Elizabeth Dickinson, is a fantastic writer, just really lyrical. And you know, like in addition to being a great caper, like I think it got at all these kind of larger ideas about why we in America are so attached to random things, why there was so much, why so many people were so interested in these ruby slippers, and what they kind of meant to America as a whole. So.
I'll be quick. I'm Lisa Jenkins,
Yeah.
and I was wondering about multimedia. Oh God, sorry. Multimedia elements.
Yeah.
If you're pitching,
Yeah.
I know a lot of us probably
Yeah.
have experience with photography or video, and if you're envisioning, okay, I'm going to do 5,000 word
Yeah.
story, but I would imagine this would go with drawings. I imagine this would go with photographs. Is that something you would share in the pitch? Is that something
Yeah.
that you guys would all figure
You
out?
can mention it. If it does, I would say that if you're just being strategic about it, if it feels like that's the centerpiece of your pitch, when I read it, I'm often going to say, this is intriguing, but it may not be for the magazine. It may be for the graphic section of the Washington Post. And you know, you get a different answer at different magazines about that. But yeah, it's absolutely something worth sharing. It gives an additional element that we're going to have to figure out then as we're figuring out whether to do the story, because our photo editor is going to have opinions about, you know, so I may think this is going to be a great story, this writer can deliver fantastic words, but then our photo editor is going to have opinions about whether the photography is up to snuff, or whether our photo editor wants to like commission his own photographer to do the photography for the story, since that's normally kind of his department. So it can introduce like a little bit of a layer of complexity, but like it's definitely not a bad thing to have more ways to tell the story. And even though we are a print magazine, we are online, and the vast majority of people who read our content read it online, and it matters to us that it be presented well online, and so and video and great art can help with that.
I think now it's time for Kimberly to. Yeah, it's time for you to say bye.
Thank you very much. Cheers to you. That was great, super informative.
Thank you.
And goodbye, everybody.
Go on to your next one.
Yes, go on to your next one. I know we went a tiny bit over, so if you want to
yeah,
grab
of
something,
course.
grab
Yeah,
it super
thanks
quick
for
and head
coming.
directly